We've come to Freiburg in West Germany, where I'm going to be talking to a man who for something like half a century has been one of the dominant influences on Western thought. He's a philosopher, a political theorist, an economist, a logician, and now widely believed to be the inspiration behind Mrs. Thatcher and her government. He's Professor Friedrich von Hayek. Professor Hayek, I'm sure you'll be well aware that to many people in Britain, and particularly on the left, you are a kind of bogeyman. You are believed to want to throw people out of work, send children down the coal mines again, grind the faces of the poor in general. I don't suppose you share that view of yourself, but would you like to start by telling us how what you obviously regard as a complete misconception of your thought has arisen?
Well, naturally I don't share it, but I must say I understand it. If you tell somebody that his past has led him to the morass, to withdraw may be even more painful than to go on where you are. And I am, I admit, in fundamental disagreement with the whole tendency policy has taken over the last generation. And I believe that the present difficulties are all due to this, and that to cure or stop the decline of Britain requires no less than a complete change of course. That means that I do not believe, as many people would agree, that socialism is half right. I'm convinced it's all wrong. And that is my starting point.
What is the dominant tendency that you speak of that you think has led us into the morass?
That we're not willing to accept the guidance by the price mechanism, which alone can enable us to create a system of international coordination where the individual efforts are not guided by the concrete knowledge of the results, but where we work for something about we only learn by abstract signals, the prices.
Why is that the only possible mechanism?
Because we don't possess the knowledge. The knowledge of facts is widely dispersed. We want to make use of knowledge possessed by millions of individual people, which they can only use if they are fed signals about the general situation. You can't reverse it, you can't possibly concentrate this knowledge. So the whole order of international cooperation has been built on such a signaling system where signals tell you about facts which nobody knows concretely in their totality. And I may add, such signals you cannot correct. You cannot correct signals which inform you about circumstances you don't know.
And these signals you mean are the prices in a free market?
Entirely the prices in the free market, which alone have made the present level of wealth possible.
But isn't the system fundamentally unjust in that, first of all, it only rewards in economic terms. Secondly, it rewards people in a way which may well be wholly disproportionate to their merit.
I admit both of this, but it can't be just. I mean, a guide system which decides which things happen to be most important for the rest of man and person cannot take any concern of the merits of the individual. Whether at a particular moment your services are very valuable to your fellow man or not does not entirely depend on you. And what we need is that people are forced to do what is beneficial to the rest, irrespective of what merit there is behind it or not. The whole idea that society can be made to behave according to human conceptions of individual morals is completely mistaken. We cannot accept from society that it's a concept that just is not applicable to society.
But surely, can't we, even if we accept your basic premise, can we not reward people in our society, not perhaps according to a scale of their virtue, but at any rate according to a scale of their needs? After all, the needs of one individual and another do not differ according to his ability to compete in the market.
No. What we can, but can only in a wealthy society, is to assure for all a certain minimum below which nobody needs to fall. Beyond this, we must use the signaling system of prices as the indicators what people ought to do. And that can have nothing to do with their individual merits or needs. Indeed, it will probably help them more to satisfy their needs if they are constantly directed to where their efforts brings the greatest benefit to their fellows than if we try to assess the rewards according to needs. It just cannot be done generally. It leads only to some people who have political powers being privileged.
But isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? That is to say, the only spur, it seems, is gain. What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in. See, both altruism and solidarity are very strong instincts which guided man in the small group where he was serving known other persons, when his efforts were directed to the needs of familiar people. Now, we have grown as rich as we are because we replaced this by a system where we no longer work for the known needs of known other people and no longer use the known assistance of other people, but where our effort is completely guided by price signals, which for the individual means that I must use my resources, or that's a maximum excess of what resources are sacrificed for the purpose. But the justification is not my benefit, but that in this way I benefit my fellow man most. So it does happen that so far as commercial activities or economic activities are concerned, we will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain. We are then completely free how to use what we have earned. And there, of course, the desire for being altruistic comes in very strongly, but not in the ordering principle of our society.
Well, where did it go wrong then? When did we get off the rails? Because there was once, at any rate, an approximation to what you're talking about. I presume you agree that it can never be perfect. No, there can never be a perfect market system. But there was once an approximation. What went wrong?
Well, I think mainly in the last century, two things happened. On the one hand, the general familiarity with the morals of the market, which were unquestionably accepted by all the members of small enterprise, by the apprentice, by the servant of the farmer and so on, was no longer naturally learned by everybody as a large organization grew. It happened to begin in manufacturing, but by now it's no longer only the factory. It's equally government organization and so on, where thousands of people grow up without any contact with the market, and their children no longer learn it automatically. Now, this coincided with a very profound philosophical influence. They not only lost a certain moral traditions, they were definitely told by the philosophers, oh, all these traditional morals are nonsense anyhow. They are superstitious taboos which you cannot intellectually justify. And so arose a new movement, and that's how I should describe socialism as an intellectual force, in which people tried to invent new morals in order to assist those natural instincts which the man still carried over from his primitive life. Instincts which had been adapted to the face-to-face society where you were serving the needs of people whom you know and using instruments you knew and discrediting all the rules which had made the large market economy possible.
Well, but both halves of this, first the fact that people are more and more in large organizations insulated from the market on the one hand, and the new philosophical tradition on the other, are not confined to Britain, are they? Is this a disease of the whole Western world?
Well, Britain is merely ahead of the rest of the world, and I think there are two reasons for it. One may surprise you, but in a sense, the leading British thinkers were more intelligible than elsewhere.
Intelligible or intelligent?
Intelligible.
Ah.
I think nobody but a fanatic would take Marx seriously. But when H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell and Bernard Shaw explained this had an enormous influence. And I believe a great part of the British public were thinking in socialist terms as a result of this education. The second factor, which is also specifically British, is that the great sympathy which the general public had with the trade unions enabled them to an extent to upset the market system, which was not possible elsewhere, just because the trade unions did not enjoy that sympathy. I think there's still the great obstacle to a reform, the illusion that you can induce people who have been granted special privileges, and that's true of the leaders of the trade unions, by nicely talking to them to abdicate these privileges is just nonsense. I think the first problem for Britain at the present moment is to free the way for new developments by reducing the coercive powers of the trade unions, which are not a result of giving them the general law, but by conferring privileges upon them, and then to restore the market, which will essentially need a monetary reform, the end of inflation. We mustn't forget that our present system is already so obstructed that in fact we probably can keep it going only by inflation. So we must first free the price mechanism, then restore a sound currency, and then there's no reason why Britain shouldn't return to old prosperity.
But you see, this brings me to another charge often levelled against you, which is that this is all very well in theory, but how do you actually bring it about in practice in the real world that we all have to live in? You talk about trade union privileges, very well. How would you go about reducing those if you think that is the vital element in our progress?
It is vital. It means that we have to take measures which in the first instance will be extremely painful, and that is the reason why I'm not sure that things may not have to get much worse before we are willing to take on us what is really required. Both to stop inflation and to restore a functioning market will cause a great deal of further disorganization, as we now see an increase of unemployment, which will be temporary, but which is not an aim of policy, of course, but an inevitable result if you stop the misdirection of resources, which was the effect of inflation in the past. So we have to face ourselves to very severe hardships if we are to return to that self-directing automatic system which alone can restore British prosperity. But and it's not only, I usually say it of inflation only, that no stabilization has ever been achieved without what we call the stabilization crisis. But in Britain it means much more. It means not only that stopping inflation is bound to bring about a very unpleasant process of unemployment, of bankruptcies and so on, that much more is required. Now my point is about the whole thing, particularly inflation, that you cannot drag out this process slowly. No government can stand a policy which would cause misery for 3 or 4 years. You must get it over in relatively few months. And the idea that you can do it slowly and still succeed is a complete illusion. I think I ought to add here a thing on your initial remark. I don't want to make it quite clear that I would never presume to advise Mrs. Thatcher, and I do not. I have no contacts in this sense. I'm of course delighted to hear that she generally believes in my sort of philosophy, but I have not got that particular knowledge about what is politically possible. She knows. I hope the right measures are already politically possible, but possibly, I think, as I said before, things may have to get much worse before they become possible.
But is there no other route to it? What about some form of general cooperation, people understanding the problem and without the pain that you described, solving up on it? Why can't that be done? See, and all men of goodwill, and there are plenty of them around still after all, if all men of goodwill cooperated together.
understanding the problem would show them that it means adaptations to facts nobody can possibly know. That for this purpose we have to return to an automatic system which brings this about, which takes into account much more than anybody knows, which involves all these changes in the present structure, which people so intensely hate. And unless you take the power from them to prevent things they hate, you will never get the adjustment which is necessary.
How are you going to take the power to prevent people obstructing developments which they will hate? Because people do have, there's a lot of entrenched power, after all, in a society like Britain. How do you diminish that power?
I'm afraid it will have to begin by diminish the powers of Parliament. I think it's Parliament which confers all these powers, and does so every time everyone complains, and he is given a new power to protect himself against other things. And I think it really begins with the idea of an unlimited legislature, called the legislature, which in fact can order any particular administrative measure it likes. So
Elective dictatorship, as we now come to call it.
Yes, if we like to call this. But my concrete suggestion on this has been to divide true legislation, laying down of general rules, and government between two different democratic elected bodies, where the one lays down the general rules, the other governs under these general rules. But that means, I think, a recovery of old political ideas, a conception of what the law means, which will take a very long time. I have been working on this, but I have no illusion that this can have any effect in solving the present crisis of Britain.
Well, if you believe that one of the things we have to do is to diminish the power of Parliament, to make it less absolute, then since only Parliament can legislate for that, you are asking people to do the one thing which history seems to suggest nobody ever does, voluntarily to relinquish a power they have. Do you expect Parliament ever to get around to doing that?
Well, if it is true, which I'm not quite certain, but which I hope, that the ultimate power is the power of the people, yes, not of Parliament, certainly, then it may well be that the people discover that they have given Parliament powers which they don't really want it to exercise. So I think you first have to convince the people they can limit the powers of Parliament, and then a new Parliament may act more reasonably. Well, I wouldn't say we may be in a position to act more reasonably than the present Parliament is. The politicians are largely driven by our system to do a great deal of nonsense. It's not that they are stupid, they can't do otherwise.
Now, all this must presumably, in your philosophy, be directed to an end. It's not gain and material improvement are not, I imagine, ends in themselves. They are an end, an important end, but they can't stop there. What lies beyond it for you?
Well, that depends on the individuals. Our task, and the common task, is to provide means for the greatest variety of purposes. And I want to leave the individuals to have a maximum of means available for their individual purposes. And I think that inquires that nobody else decides for them for what purpose they are to use it. But that's a common organization. Well, not the common. There may be common organizations for ideal purposes, but the compulsory powers of government are solely directed to providing the people with means which they can use for their own purposes. That is my fundamental conception.
Would you say that your idea of liberty itself, which obviously is the framework within which you think and operate, is derived first, at any rate, from economic liberty, in a sense that it all hangs upon that?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite that way. I certainly came to understand what liberty means by studying economics. That liberty is not a natural liberty in the Rousseauian sense, but something which the law gives us by protecting us against the violence of others, including government. But I believe what originally was for me an economic approach stands the test of its general validity. It's more easy to see in the economic field. And see, at the present moment, you have the very curious phenomenon in the world. It's a revival of liberalism, which did not start among the economists, is now due to the economists. I'm trying to keep an international society of scholars alive who believe in my sort of liberalism. It consists almost exclusively of economists. They're the only one who are beginning to see the dangers which we are approaching.
Of course, the instrument, as far as I understand your philosophy, for all this is law, isn't it? To you, the law is perhaps the bedrock on which everything else rests, the rule of law.
Surely.
Now, however, do not agree that law itself can be unjust in this sense, that law is made by people, by human beings, and they tend to make it in their own interests. Yeah. The game laws of the 18th century were devised to prevent poor people taking the pheasants and the rabbits of the rich people. Now, won't that always be so, that law is made in the interests of those making it, and the rest are shut out? And that therefore the protection of the law is, in a sense, illusory.
I'm glad you raised this problem, because it shows very beautifully how the prevalence of a political philosophy can keep the law in the right limit. In the 19th century, I think this conception that only that was law, which was a general rule equally applicable to all, and giving us all the same chances and advantages, has become very generally spread. It's in trying to help particular people that we have destroyed this conception of law as a general rule. So, surely, preserving the kind of law which I want presupposes a sort of general philosophy, which in an imperfect form existed. And if you look into the writings of Tocqueville or even Burke already, or Lord Acton, you have a very highly developed philosophical basis for the conception of the rule of law. But while the people are still being praised, they're no longer read. Incidentally, if I may, I find one of the most interesting sources of the legal philosophy of the free society in the writings of the English legal philosophers of the 19th century. People like Maine and Maitland and Pollock and Dicey. I think there we find a deeper understanding of the basic principle of liberalism than anywhere else.
You know, it seems to me, to some extent at any rate, that you are demanding something that is impossible, that your beliefs, the execution of your beliefs, the solution to the problems you propose, seem to depend on people in general, I don't mean their leaders, but the whole people, being infinitely wiser than is likely in the ordinary run of human nature.
No. I think you're right to that extent that what I'm wanting may be impossible in the present state of opinion. And then I must return to what I say, it may be things have to get much worse before we can do anything. But it's not a question of wisdom. Ultimately, all our moral institutions depend on more or less irrational traditional beliefs. And while it may be very difficult deliberately to create a tradition, just as the intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th century have created a bias towards the socialist conception, I think a change of opinion in the intellectuals may, without their being understood, again create a moral background of opinion which is really favorable to liberty in my sense. But it may, of course, mean that the kind of reforms which I want may come only in 100 years' time.
Well, the British don't exactly have a reputation for paying great attention to the intellectuals, do they?
No, they don't. But
I mean, we like to think of ourselves as essentially a pragmatic people.
Yes, but I think on that particular point, one of very few where John Maynard Keynes was very wise, that most politicians ultimately spout the ideas of the intellectuals of a generation or two ago. Yes. And in that sense, it's equally true of the British.
It's equally true of Keynes and his influence, I may say. Exactly. Even more so, in fact, yes.
So in the long run, opinions are being made by thinkers, even if they have no influence on current affairs.
Well, now, you are almost exactly, are you not, the same age as the century. And in that century, the world has come to an end several times. 2 world wars, the rise of modern totalitarianism, the hideous atrocities that has led to, new barbarisms, it sometimes seems, springing up almost daily in various parts of the world. Don't you feel, or do you feel, I want to know, that the whole world, in one way or another, is sliding down to some form of extinction, not necessarily nuclear extinction, cultural suicide, if you like? Are you pessimistic in that sense, or optimistic?
On the whole, pessimistic, although my formula, which I've used many times already, is that if the politicians do not destroy the world in the next 20 years, there's good hope. Because there is everywhere a young generation springing up among not only economists, thinkers, who see most of the defects. And so if you survive the next 10 or 20 years, I think there's quite good hope. Of course I'm working for a chance of surviving it, but for the time I still have to live, I'm very pessimistic, I admit.
What about your attitude in this respect, pessimism or optimism, about Britain herself? You have put forward solutions to our problems, as others have. Do you think, in fact, never mind the should and the shouldn't, but do you think, in fact, we are going to solve our problems? Of course, you argue that there is only really one way in which we are to solve our problems, but do you think we will, in fact, in some way or another, achieve it?
It's touch and go. I believe if Mrs. Thatcher had the full support of her parties, there was a very good chance that we would. No more than a good chance. But I'm becoming more and more apprehensive. I think it is becoming quite clear that there are people who are conservative in the old sense, afraid from too drastic measures. And Britain now needs drastic measures. Britain has gone so far on the downhill slope that a cure must be a fairly quick and fairly painful process.
But surely isn't this argument fundamentally incompatible with democracy? Because in the end, in a democracy, the people will decide, and people will not, or perhaps they will, but I think on balance it seems probably will not, willingly face going into greater pain, greater upheaval, greater difficulty, great unemployment, all the rest of it. People don't want that. Naturally they don't want it. Surely democracy itself will stultify your hoped-for advance.
Well, I think you are too pessimistic about the views of the people at large. Our present form of democracy, which puts politicians under pressure to satisfy any number of special interests, I think is pretty hopeless. But as regards the views of the people at large, I'm not so pessimistic. Somebody who has really power to explain to them, remember Churchill in 1940? He succeeded in changing around public opinion at a time when the British intellectuals, if I may say so, were in a lamentable state of complete collapse. And yet one man could rally the people to a resistance against something which they knew would be extremely painful. It would have been much easier in 1940 to give in to Hitler. Nothing would have happened. I think in the same sense it is conceivable, and if I may mention one way, in Parliament it seems impossible now to get drastic action of depriving the trade unions of their privileges. I think if you put to the people at large in a referendum the simple question, are the trade unions to be deprived of all the special privileges not granted to other citizens, you would get an overwhelming majority. So in a sense I would appeal to democracy on the route, rather. I'm not hopeless about democracy.
People may will the end, will they also will the means? To say that depriving trade unions of their privileges, people may say, yes, yes, let's do it. Do you think people are willing to face the upheaval, the industrial chaos that would inevitably follow such an attempt?
Well, I hope that if Parliament has very definite instructions from a referendum in rather general terms, it may be difficult from the Parliament to avoid this duty or escape this duty.
Thank you very much.